We've been talking about the most interesting man in history and what he did, and giving definition to what he did. I know that when I came to Christ, the message I got was this: Jesus died for your sins, and now you need to work hard to show him how happy you are for that. And that's what I started out doing. But he did so much more than that. And what he did was so much better than anything that had ever happened before. Hebrews uses that term 13 times, and what he did is just better. It's just a whole lot better. And so what he did is that he came and he was actually God. He was actually a man with God's life in him. And he was a new creation, and he came down and he conquered everything that was pitted against man. And yet the amazing thing about him that we forget is it wasn't him doing it, it was God doing it through him. He lived his life completely dependent on him. Now, I don't know what any of you would do in this room if you woke up in the morning in a coffin and it was nailed shut. What would you do? Well, I think I might hit the panic button and start clawing. I don't know what it would be like when you're God and one day you wake up in the body of a baby. And I imagine you'd cry. I bet the baby Jesus was crying. And it was an amazing experience for him. And what he did at that point is he looked around and said, the only way you could live life here is if I stay connected to God and God lives it through me. And so as God lived his life through him, Jesus conquered sin and Satan and the world. And then God put the sins of the whole world on him. And that was so much sin that it drove the life out of him. And then sin encased him like concrete, and then death encased him, and then captivity encased him, and he kept sinking until he came to the place of hell. And there he rested. And they thought they'd hindered him. And yet that was the place that he came to plunder. And he broke the power of all those things. He actually looted the place, and then God reconnected with him and raised him and transformed his body. And now he wants to give that life to me, his exact life, and let it flow through me. And it's a life of rest, and it's a life of peace, and it's a life of joy. And now this life begins to flow through me. And he wants to connect other people to himself in the same way. Now here's a problem that we have today, and it's existed for a long time. And that's the problem of kingdom builders. People want to build kingdoms. And so what they do is they go out, and instead of connecting people to Christ and making Christ the emphasis, and this has been a big frustration for me because, and I imagine it's one for you, when I came to Christ, did people tell you, like they told me, that all you needed was Jesus? But ever since that day, all I've been hearing from believers is that I need more than Jesus. I need this program, and I need this plan, and I need this education, and I need to do this, and do. And then I can come underneath them and be connected not to Christ, but to the man and to his kingdom. And so we end up with men who are kingdom builders, and they're connecting other people to themselves and not connecting them to Christ. Now, when you get enough kingdom builders go, they begin to set the model, and so now you've got to connect people to you and start building your kingdom. Eventually, someone out here is going to connect a doer to themselves. Well, you connect a doer to himself, and he's ready to go start his own kingdom. Now, there's a threat. So we begin to build a wall around here to maintain these people and to contain them, and we bring them under bondage with a bunch of rules and laws, casting Christ aside and saying, until you meet these rules, you'll never achieve, you'll never arrive, you'll never be able to get out on your own. Now, then they start throwing out terms like this and little stories about Moses and how the people rebelled against Moses and that they're in authority and you don't want to be rebelling against them. And you need to be under their authority. And then you get all this teaching on authority. If you look at Paul's exercise of authority, he used his authority to bring you under Christ's authority, never his. He never wanted anybody under his. And when you're in a group or an organization where the word authority is used to bring you under their authority, you're in a cult. Now, a cult is not a teaching. A cult is an attitude. You can have all the right teaching with the wrong attitude, and you're in a cult. And so we have these people who are using these terms of authority, and all it means is that I want to keep you in my kingdom. I don't want you moving out. And boy, does it sap the life out of you, doesn't it? The things you talk about, the things you discuss, the lists that you have to go over, It's frightening. What we want to do instead is to see people attached to Christ. That's always our goal, not to anyone else. Now, as we look at this model, we want to do a little more defining and look at the distinction between, and I don't know if this confuses you, but what is Adam life? What is my old life? What is my self life? What is my flesh life? And what is my old nature? Anybody find all that confusing besides me? Now, what the Adam life is that I was born with a life in me that was cut off from God. And that is Adam's life. So we can use a simple little diagram for that here's Adam and Eve, and they had children all the way down to you. This is a little diagram from Watchman Nee. And they had children all the way down to here. This is your mother. If your mother would have died when she was 3 years old, what would have happened to you? Well, you wouldn't be here today. Where were you when your mother was 3? Well, you were in her. And so that's a neat little fact that every baby girl is born with all the eggs that she'll ever have. And we always say when you're holding a baby, be very, very gentle, because you're holding generations in that little girl. And if your great-great-grandmother would have died in 700 BC, and Dave Templeton's the only one that knows who his great-great-grandmother was in 700 BC, if she would have died at age 3 in that plague, you wouldn't be here. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, you were in them. When they fell away from God, you fell away from God. You were born with Adam's life that is cut off from God. And one of the things that happened is the day that he was crucified, he took your old life and he moved it into him. And wherever your relatives were, you were in them, and now you're in Christ. So if you're in him and he was there when the world was created, you were there. He knew you from the foundations of the earth. If he's seated in heaven and you're in him, then you're in heaven. You're seated in heavenly places. But if he was killed and crucified, what happened to you? The same thing. So this life was killed and crucified, and you received a brand new life, which is Christ's life. The Adam life, or the old life, was crucified with Christ. Something had to be crucified with Christ. And we don't believe that what happened is, which many people will teach, is that Adam's life moved over, and Christ's life moved in, and now the two fight each other. And it's your job to help Jesus win. Well, you've done a stellar job so far, haven't you? Helping Jesus. And Jesus doesn't need my help. And what this really is Christian Buddhism, which is the yin and the yang fighting, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, if the Adam life is not crucified, there's absolutely no way that Christ's life is going to be able to inhabit you and flow through you. It's crucial that we see that the Adam life has been crucified. So we know the Adam life and the old life are the same thing. Now, in that context, we're told to take up the cross and deny ourselves daily. So what is that talking about? It can't be the Adam life because it's been crucified, buried, and it's dead. So what is my self-life? What's the definition of self-life? Well, to understand yourself again, go back to understanding God's self. Yourself is your very being. It's everything that you are. It is your very nature. And if we look at God's self, we see that some of the things that describe what God is His love and His peace. He will not worship another. It's His word that's living. It's His mercy. It's His judgment. It's His forgiveness. It's His law that's perfect. Do you know that in God's law, He's always doing it in a way that He's making the best out of a bad situation? It's the best that can be done out of His IQ. His law is perfect. He's a protector, He's a provider, He's a guide, He's a father, He's wisdom. This is the very nature and the very being of God. This is His self. Now, if God is going to make you in His image, then He has to put all of these things into you. But here's a problem. He put those things in Adam, and then Adam chose to walk away from God. He had an outer life and an inner life, and his inner life chose to not be in fellowship with God, to not come under God, but to be God himself. And when he chose that, he fell away from God, and Adam became something that he was not before. Adam became a human being. Now, before, the life in him ruled, but now the things around him rule. His body rules. Sin and Satan in the world rules, and they all conquer him, and he is defeated in every area. He's become a human being. If you take the characteristics of God, put them in a being, and then that being falls, those characteristics now become distorted in this being because they're not created to be there. You can't take the characteristics of God and put them in a fallen man. And so the distortion comes, and man's self-life is actually his being or his humanity. It's being a human. That's what self-life is. It's humanity. And it's now, and what humanity is the distortion of the characteristics of God living in this flesh and blood. So what we have here is conditional love instead of pure love. We don't have peace, we have conflicts. We have the desire to be worshipped as gods. We have words that have no power in them. We make judgments and they're all wrong. We're not full of forgiveness, we're full of unforgiveness. And this is just a description of what humanity is. This is really true humanity. We give laws for control, not for protection, not out of love. We're self-protective. We have self-gratification. We're full of chaos. We want to create master-slave relationships. We're full of foolishness and stupidity. Now, that is what being a human being is. So in Luke 9:23, when we're talking about taking up the cross and denying ourselves daily, we're talking about denying our humanity, our human being, what we are without Christ in charge of our lives. Now, as Christ flows through me, as the Father flows into the Son, and the Son flows into me, and I have the door open to Christ's life, His life flows out of me, and I express His being, and I express His fruit. It is the fruit of the Spirit. It is not the fruit of humanity. It's not the fruit of man. It's not my fruit. It's His fruit. It has to come from Him. Now, as that happens then, Christ's life is multiplied on the earth. And greater things than He did, you'll be doing, because He's already won the battle for you, and He's living His life not looking forward to the final victory. The final victory's already come, and He's living out of you. It's unhindered. And so we find ourselves doing greater things than He did, but it's not us doing it, is it? It's Him doing it through us. Now, the goal then is for humanity or self is to close the door to Christ's life and to let my humanity take over and block this life and then express humanity through my being. And when that happens and it's flowing through, I'll produce the deeds of the flesh. Because now I'm not living in spiritual power, I'm living out of the power of the flesh. And even though my position's different, my condition's the same. So what I'll do then is I have Christ in me, and if I close this door to Christ's life above me, then all I do is live in soul power, which is the flesh, which is what an animal has. And flesh life or carnal life is an animal life. That's how I'm going to live my life, and it won't be an expression of Christ, and it won't be fruit. Instead, it's going to be the deeds of the flesh. When you see the deeds of the flesh, don't be consequence conscious, be cause conscious, and go back to why. Why is this person expressing flesh? Why are you expressing flesh? People think their drinking is the problem. They think their drugs are the problem. They think their lust is the problem. Their slander is the problem. It's never the problem. The problem is I've shut the door to Christ's life, and I'm living a situation in the power of my humanity. Now, here's how Satan goes about in the world to get me to close that door and to live in the power of my humanity. What it does, first of all, is work in the area of unbelief. So a situation, a circumstance, a person, an event comes, and the first thing you believe is that Christ in you can't handle it. And as soon as you believe that, this door closes, and now in the power of your humanity, which remember is your fallen nature and all of your distorted characteristics that you got from God, you're going to begin to fix the problem. Do you think that's going to create a little bit of stress? That in my humanness, I'm going to go ahead and fix other human problems. That's the plan A. Plan B is to keep the door closed. And many of us have heard this. As you're living in your humanity, you're not being a success, you're only expressing flesh, and your flesh is building up the flesh of others. So you're working in this humanity and nothing's working out. A good example of that's a fellow who called me, and he said, "Brother, my wife's just undone. She's having a hard time. She's coming at me about the things out of our past, things that have happened in the past, things I've done," which is, Satan always comes to you from your past. He'll never come to you from your future. Because in your future, I'm telling you this, you're going to end well. Because you got Christ in you. But he likes to come from your past. So she's coming from his past, reminding him of everything. And I said, "Well, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm walking on eggshells. I'm trying to appease her. I'm trying to please her. I'm trying to calm her down. I just keep talking to her. I've brought her flowers. I've done this. I've done that." And he got all done with that and told me everything he'd done. And when he finished telling me everything he'd done, I asked him a question. "When's the last time you were at the porno store?" He says, "Why are you asking that? I didn't call you about that. I just called you to tell you she's having a hard time. Things from the past have come up. It's a real attack. I'm doing everything I can to appease her." I said, "I know. When's the last time you were at the porno store?" And there's a long pause, and he goes, "Last night." He said, "Why are you asking me that?" And I said, "Well, brother, I used to have horses. And we had two horses. One was Blondie and the other one was Dew. Dew was a rodeo horse. Blondie was a really just a kid horse. And Blondie was white and Dew was black. And so you go to the corral at night, and whenever you went to the corral, Dew would come over here because he never wanted you to catch him. He never wanted to go riding. Blondie would be right here to cuddle with you and to get a sugar cube, and she really liked you and wanted out and liked the ride. And so Blondie would be there, and the second you cracked the door for Blondie, Dew came like a rocket out of here, and he was out the gate. He was using her to get out. Do you know that the good deeds of the flesh will use the bad deeds of the bad deeds of the flesh will use the good deeds of the flesh to get out? Because good and evil are the same side of one coin. They both exist from the same tree, the knowledge of good and evil. And I said, "Brother, what you're doing is in the power of your flesh and in your humanity, you're trying to fix your wife's flesh and her humanity. And so it looks real good to you because you've opened the door in the good deeds of the flesh and in your humanity. But now I knew you would let out the bad if you let out the good." It's a real trap. Our humanity never does fix a problem. Now, when we fall out with God, which is the real problem, and that's when we fall out with others and we fall out with ourselves, we finally get so depressed trying to live the Christian life in this power that we're ready to go back to Jesus. And as soon as you crack that door a little bit, here's what the enemy is going to whisper to you. If you open this door and let his life flow into you and you move back to him, you're going to have to live divinity in your humanity. Have you ever heard that? You've fallen so far away from him that when you look back up at him, all you see is, if I have to go ahead, if I go back to him, I'm going to have to try in the power of my humanity to live divinity, and I've already failed at it too many times. I can't cope with it and I can't handle it. And so you'll see someone who starts up here and they're with Christ and everything's fine, and they tumble and they take a fall and they end up in sin and they keep failing, and they get all the way down here and they're finally laying in a pit, and all they can see are all the obstacles and everything they'd have to climb to get back to Jesus. And they just can't do it. Because I know in the power of myself, my humanity, if I get back up here, I'm going to be expected to live like Jesus again, to imitate Jesus, and I can't. You know, a beautiful thing is there's a little escalator right here. Just roll your toes over on it. It'll run you to the top. Because it's all powered by the blood of Christ. And there's another thing about this. You learn things in failure that you can't learn in success. I just want to know, how could you learn the love of God and never have a failure in your life? How could you do that? Because as long, and many of us in this room still haven't learned the love of God because we want to bring a contribution to God. And it's not until I can say, I have no contribution, I just have nothing here, God, and then hear Him whisper to me, I love you, that I'm finally entering into what the real love of God is. And there's power in that love, and that frees me in all the work that I do, and it has ramifications in my whole life. But what the enemy will always whisper to you, and this is the bottom line, if you go back to Jesus, you'll see a contrast between Him and you that you won't be able to handle. You'll be frustrated, and you've got to live divinity in the power of your humanity, and you haven't been able to do it. And those very thoughts will keep the door closed in my life. So what I'm saying is what is the self-life that has to be denied? The self-life is my being or my humanity, which is always willing to take over the whole world, just as Adam wanted to do in the garden. Now, some people define the old nature as Adam life, and I wouldn't agree with that because the Adam life had to be crucified. But if you wanted to define the old nature as your humanity, I would agree with that. And if you see that that has to be denied daily, because there's always the temptation for my humanity to take over and for me to begin to play God like Adam played God. Now, here's an interesting thing. Humanity wants to be God so bad, but it can't give us any good examples of a human playing God very well, can it? And so what humanity does is that it scours the earth looking for someone who in their humanity has been a success at 5%. And you would think from listening that they'd been a success at 100%. And that's why we idolize men for the mundane. I mean, a guy climbs a mountain over 50 years ago and he's been able to make a living out of that? For 50 years he's able to make a living? It's like he's a god. Well, what has he really accomplished? This is something humanity has done. See, so somebody out there is making it. Well, are they really making it? What's that all about? It's just amplified under a magnifying glass. The guy could be a complete failure. Gandhi, they treat him as a god. What did Gandhi accomplish? When he died, India was in worse shape than it was before. And when he died, it didn't change the fact that there's still a caste of people in India that can't wear clothes. They're not allowed to wear clothes. Another caste that isn't allowed to go out in the daytime. Another caste whose job is where they build these big high-rise buildings. All the sewage dumps into a central tank. And there's a caste that it's their job every day to move the lid on that and drop themselves down in the human sewage and scoop that out and put it in a bucket and put it in a cart and take it out of town. Didn't change any of that. Well, but he got rid of the British. Well, what did that do? It's still just humanism. It's defining what would be a success and saying that this person, in the power of their flesh, was able to accomplish something. Mother Teresa. Do you know, I know Indians that have worked for Mother Teresa, and I really don't care one way or other. These are just what they tell me. They worked for her. They said, you know, you might see her on TV daubing a guy's head that's dying from leprosy, but she'd turn around and cut your throat. She was mean. She had things in charge. She'd leave people just bloody stumps. But see, we don't talk about that. What we do is we take the 5% where she succeeded as being a human being and playing God, and we amplify that and say that's the cause for humanity. Always whispering in our ears what we can do. And we do the same thing in Christianity where we take people who have succeeded at 5% at raising their kids or at memorizing scriptures or at witnessing to other people, and we put them on a pedestal and we amplify the 5%. And I'm left having to do that in the power of myself. We're encouraged all the time to live out of the power of self, not to live out of Him. Not to let Him do it. So He loves to have the door closed and me working in the power of self. And here's an amazing thing. When I begin to fix things in my humanity, the first thing I do is protect my humanity at all costs. How many of us have done that? And I've spent that much time protecting myself. Somebody saying something negative about my humanity. Well, does this really look like anything that I ought to be protecting anyway? Is it anything that positive? And the funny thing is I spend half my time protecting myself. How could Betty say that to me? How could this other person say that to me? How could I be treated that way? And then I spent the rest of my time hating myself at the failures that I've had in the power of self. And I couldn't tell you the nights that I have laid in bed and prayed and wished and hoped that I could go back to being dust, and why did God ever create me? And I'm afraid to even go into the thoughts of what kind of husband have I been, what kind of father have I been, are my children's problems, my problems, what have I done to other people, how have I done this? And it's just totally self-consumed with self-hatred. And do you know that gets so great that we protect ourselves and then we hate ourselves? The pain in that is incredible until finally we have to go find some kind of sedative. And that's where people go to drugs, alcohol, sex, obsession, shopping, all of those kind of things. Anything to get my mind off of me because I can't handle this pain anymore of self being such a failure. And that's one of the things. I'll just go to buy a little bitty voice recorder and search the web for 6 hours. Reading the facts and what is it and how much does it cost and all. It's an obsession. You can see me do it when I'm in self. I haven't denied it. I'm living in the power of it, and I want to get it all perfectly right. I cannot live divinity in my humanity. Now, here's how that's changed me, and we'll work it out in a practical way. The first thing Betty does is offend me. And so I protect myself. And God comes to me with the command, husbands, love your wives. Well, she doesn't deserve to be loved. She ought to be loving me. She's the one that ought to be doing it. Shouldn't be treating someone like that. I wonder if she knows anything at all about submission. She ought to be meeting my needs. I want her to change my humanity. But see, the problem is, in my humanity, I still want to play God, and so any commandment that God gives me, I'm going to keep it. So now I'm feeling guilty because I'm not loving her. So now what do I do? And I'm laying there in complete guilt. And here's what I've started doing. I walk out in the room and I say this, Father, this is a job for divinity, not humanity. You come and be my divinity. You come and be the divine in me. I can't do it. You come. You know, I sat down the other day and I was going to write a letter to my son. He was having a few struggles and I wanted to talk to him. And I had the whole thing written. And then I just stopped and I'd written it all in my humanity. And I said, Father, this is a job for the divine. You come and be divine in me. The door opens. Christ's life flows through me. Do you know what I did? I hit the delete button. And he said, I'm working there. You be quiet. So I was quiet. If we can learn to live this way and take up the cross daily and deny self, everything changes. I don't have to protect myself. I don't have to go through the guilt and the self-hatred of it. But I can actually just sit there and lay this whole thing aside. Let Christ come into every situation. I'm afraid to go anywhere now. I walk around the corner and say, this is a job for the divine. You come and be divinity through me and live your life there. Amen.